Greetings, everyone. Excited to be here with you all. I'm just gonna kind of kick things off a little bit for today's session and talk about an anecdote just for starters. So I think it was 3 years ago, the federal government released a contract to AT&T to promote broadband expansion and actually put in fiber lines and tech lines. And specifically, this was a contract for Texas and a couple of different counties in Texas. AT&T went in. They're very pro at this sort of infrastructure construction deployment. And what was found through a ProPublica report a year after is that there was literally a set of train tracks in one county, and on one side of the tracks was a much more privileged, predominantly white set of communities, and on the other side of the tracks was predominantly Latinx, low income. And although the contract for digital infrastructure and connectivity was supposed to be equal throughout, what was found is that on the wealthier side, the minimum broadband that was put out had a higher speed. It was a higher throughput. And then there was tiered ratings, like you probably do for your own internet, to actually have a higher speed in that way. On the lower income side of the tracks, there were no levels of access, and actually the speed that was delivered was below the minimum contracted rate. And so this became a really large story in the tech community and in the deployment community, and it really shows this concept of what's now being called digital redlining. So that recognizing that the services and the technologies that we are looking to deploy are not in a politically neutral, in a power neutral, or a socioeconomically neutral space. It's not objective at all. And a lot of it is driven by power, a lot of it is driven by economics, and a lot of that is in economics of exploitation. So I'm just gonna kind of dip into some of the background of US agriculture and the history of racism in agriculture. And this could be like a whole session into itself. It really should be. But I just want to touch upon it and make sure that these histories are noted and recognized for the session that we're moving through today. So, we have to start with the extreme consequence of native genocide all across this landmass in the US, in North America, and also in many other parts of the world. But I'm sitting here in Lishan Ohlone territory in the San Francisco Bay Area and the East Bay. And in the Bay Area, these are unceded territories like they are in so many other parts of California and the country. And the communities are really still driving forward a need and a vision for food sovereignty in their own right. And because of gentrification, because of the difficulty of affording a lifestyle here in the Bay Area, it becomes increasingly more and more difficult. Then, as we saw the settlement and colonization of the country, there's a large conversion of land and manipulation of water waves to drive forward agricultural industrialization. A lot of that was through the exploitation of labor of African and African Americans through chattel slavery. We saw what happened after the Civil War with Special Field Order 15, which was the 40 acres and a mule decree where 400,000 acres of land was transferred to Black ownership in the Southeast coast. And that was land that African Americans have been working for a century plus and have basically generated so much value that was then extracted from their labor. A year later, that order was revoked by Andrew Jackson, who also was responsible for an incredible amount of Native genocide. We keep continuing to move forward. There's the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which was the first, immigration, anti-immigration act that we had in the US. The Japanese suffered through the California Alien Land Law Act of 1913. Executive Order 966 was Japanese internment in 1942, largely derived because so many Nikkei farmers, Japanese American farmers in the US had land that was valued at 10 times more productive than a lot of surrounding lands by European settlers. And so there was a Salinas food processing manufacturer and kind of titan that went to DC and said, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, that we can't trust any of them, we have to intern them. And then that moved forward. We moved through Mexican repatriation and the Bracero program to currently 2.3 million farm workers are working and are 73% of the labor in the US. And obviously we have massive issues with health, rights, labor, immigration, and systemic racism in our labor programs. And currently 98% of all agricultural land is owned by whites. We have land loss that was perpetuated through policies such as heirs property and other Jim Crow era laws that were similar to redlining and tax debtorship. And then currently, a majority of our lands are just incredibly consolidated, which also goes towards seeds, ag inputs, the supply chain, and so much more. There's 10 companies that control over 80% of the food supply chain in the US. Sorry, that's globally. And that this current food system also generates and externalizes so much harms that everyone here knows about in terms of ecological harms, public health and human health harms, socioeconomic, and the political ones that we're talking about. So this is why I think there is a large push towards food sovereignty and the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food production produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and the rights to define their own food and agricultural systems. It is a rights-based approach that centers those that are responsible for the labor and what I would say the functioning of our food system, which we've seen in the past 2 years of the pandemic, this notion of essential workers that have actually been sacrificed the most and have been continued to be exploited in that sort of way. So we have this food system, which is the current food system. It is really important for us to characterize what that is. And now we look at these evolving technologies, and especially digital technologies, as a way that we will engage in that food system and try to improve certain parts of it. This is the narrative that we're going to address directly. But again, recognizing that we're not just employing technologies, whatever types of technologies they are, into a neutral food system, into just saying that we need to increase yields, we need to feed people. We're going to break a lot of those down in the next few minutes. I want to start off just by talking about this really great line by Kentaro Toyama, who's a professor at the University of Michigan in human-computer interaction studies, and was one of the principal leads of Microsoft Research in India that worked on a lot of digital agricultural technologies with smallholder farmers. So Kentaro states, after decades of experience in technology deployment, that essentially, when it comes down to it, technology is an exacerbator. And what he means by that is that when you actually deploy technologies in a space that has a lot of health, strong rights, strong equity, then technology can actually help improve a system. It can exacerbate those strong equities that we're tying into it. So for the example, we are in a virtual conference, we are interacting through a virtual platform, we have access to this technology, And so for us, this really helps engage in interaction and connectivity and education and learning, and to grow this work that we're trying to come together around. But we also recognize the huge amount of communities that do not have access to these technologies, that do not have connectivity. And so there is, these spaces where technology can actually be introduced into a place of inequity and exacerbate inequities. And fundamentally, we have to understand the context and the histories of where we are deploying any type of application or technology into. And, kind of at the end of my talk here, I'm just going to be speaking a little bit about where some of the technology deployments in agriculture can lead us to, by looking at other sectors that have a much more integrated approach, and kind of some of the aspects of that provide some actually warning signals and insights in ways that we can actually start thinking about a more equitable form of development. So quickly, there's this kind of narrative around digital technologies. There's a study that came out of the Netherlands that looked at all the different ag tech, manufacturing, deployment, advertisements, and it found that 90% of everything that it reviewed had this narrative. And I'll break it down into like these kind of 4 or 5 parts. So the first part goes, we need to feed 10 billion people by 2050. And this is all around food security. The second part goes, this requires us to grow 70% more food. Third, we have a finite amount of land and resources to produce more food. Fourth, we need more information, more service tools, and more labor to increase those yields. And the fifth is that digital technologies can meet those needs. And that sounds very straightforward, and it sounds right. And it's a narrative that has been put out for about 30, 40, 50 years in looking at food production. But then when we look at breaking each of these down, the first one, we need to feed 10 billion people by 2050, that actually looks at population models that don't incorporate increased gender equity, around education, around family planning. And so that number is basically suggesting 10 billion people will be on the planet by 2050 if we continue the really inequitable forms of development and exploitation and imperialism that we currently are on the trajectory for. The second part, requiring us to grow 70% more food, not acknowledging that 27% of US crops are consumed directly for food, and that's the same for 55% of the world. 67% of our crops goes towards animal feed, which that takes up 80% of land, but only goes towards 20% of the world's calories. So the design of our current food system isn't meant for actually feeding people. It's not meant for feeding people in a nutritious and healthy way. And so when we're saying that we need to just directly go towards technologies to exacerbate this system, how is it actually meeting these goals? And then the next one, in terms of the finite amount of land and resources, we've actually shown and described how they're being used so poorly. When we look at coming down to, we need more information and service tools and labor to increase yields. I think this has a complete lack of evidence around, in terms of saying that we actually don't know enough. We don't have enough information or enough sensing and work around the labor that exists. And so we need to increase this through sensor technology. We need to increase this through LiDAR and a number of other means. And I'll just note, as someone that's worked on data systems and decision support systems using huge amounts of data, that the sensing of data is very different than the sense making of data. And so we often come into this aspect called analysis paralysis, where there's way too much data to make sense of, and then you don't know how to actually prioritize decision making according to your needs. You actually need to have the right amount of data and the correct amount of data, It has to be appropriate, the types of data towards the decisions that you need to make. And we actually haven't done a thorough vetting of that. We are really pushing forward just an increased amount of data that we need to generate for some sort of purpose that hasn't actually panned out. And then the last part of digital technologies meeting these needs, again, there is a lot of evidence around the impacts of automation and the efficacy around productivity. We have data about sustainable intensification around farms, and actually how that has led to increased consumption of water, of fertilizers, of resources, and others. It actually doesn't make the farm more efficient in terms of the overall impact. It just leads towards more farming, right? So there's all these different spaces where these elements fit into. We also seen that in terms of worker equity, technology has actually led to wage declines, and it's shown to limit productivity gains, especially in entry-level sort of work. So it's kind of twisted in that way. So I just want to end on this aspect of a cautionary tale. And, I'm sorry, I'm not coming in here with a lot of solutions and recommendations. I actually don't see that as the purpose of this talk. This talk is just looking at what are the impacts straight up. And that should then help deliver a dialogue around how can we actually look towards promoting an equitable form of deployment, one that centers workers, one that centers labor, one that centers food sovereignty, and not going to just continue to empower consolidation around agriculture, consolidation around technology, through data companies, through web services and other platforms. And this is where a lot of the capital in this space is coming from. And it continues this kind of exploitation map. So I'm going to end with this example of a smart factory. So in terms of warehouses, in terms of storage places, you can think Amazon, you can think a lot of other food companies, but it's so much more. And this part of the food value chain has integrated technology most deeply. There's a colleague of mine, it's a fellow at Stanford, Matt Bean, professor at UC Santa Barbara, who studies automation and technology deployment in factories. He actually does direct observation of workers. And so what has happened is you have so much control and sensing and roboticization of the factory that you're actually trying to de-skill workers. So you'll have a worker that does this move 10,000 times in a day. By reducing the variability, you reduce the costs. You can also, because a lot of these workers aren't full-time, they don't have health benefits and they don't have a lot of other things to support their work and livelihood. So that when you have this sort of motion repeating, you get a lot of adverse health effects in your body. But because of the way that we treat workers and the lack of protections, they're just discarded in that sort of way. And we have monitoring of, breaks, of break time, because there's so much kind of camera work. Again, this comes directly from Matt and a lot of his studies. You have, so much video and observation. There's not places to have conversations, right? There's not places to organize. There's not places to actually develop that sort of social capital that then leads towards those types of worker protections. And so what he was saying is that this didn't happen by design, that as different technologies became available, the factory and warehousing sector just started deploying them. So it was like this kind of ad hoc sequence of technology integration that didn't have an overall design and understanding of where is it that we actually want to go, right? So how are we trying to get towards a type of functionality that we can address the needs that we have to, but we're also lifting up and centering the workers that are responsible for that. And you'll hear later on from Eric and from several others of how right now there's this narrative of trying to replace workers. And as we see in the factories, that doesn't happen. You still need human labor to drive forward the machines. what does happen is that the human labor becomes discounted. It becomes subservient towards a roboticized form of labor and a technologized form of labor. And that is then subservient towards capital gains and towards socioeconomic and other forms of exploitation. And again, just recognizing the systemic racism of this and the racial injustice part of this is that the majority of these workers are Black, Native, Latinx, and other people of color. And through whether it's U.S. residents or others, we just continue to inform this type of exploitation and othering of oh, that's me, sorry, of people that we've seen historically have been marginalized in our communities. So we're going to start off with that, and I hope that others can kind of take this forward and maybe lift up ways that we can do this work more equitably and centering the people that we really should be centering. And yeah, just thanks so much for taking the time and joining us with this, and I'll hand it back over.